Well, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Nancy Leifer, and I am co-president of the Missoula League of Women Voters. And what I'd like to do to start off here while we're waiting for a few more folks to come in, I'd like to start off with a quote that I saw on a bumper sticker on my way over here. And this is the quote that I saw. It said, "The well-being of each of us fundamentally depends on the well-being of all of us." And that was a quote from Theodore Roosevelt. And I thought, whoa, what a great way to start this discussion, because we certainly are at a point right now where the well-being of a lot of folks in Missoula compared to their housing costs is just not there for a lot of folks. So that's why we're here. And we have a lot of information planned for you tonight. I thought I'd start out, though, with a little bit about who the League of Women Voters is. The League of Women Voters was founded in 1920, in February of 1920, 6 months before women won approval for the right to vote for the 19th Amendment. And it was founded because there was foresight in thinking that we would need to have some nonpartisan information for women to be able to understand how politics works, how the government works, and how to be involved in our democracy. And that's what we've been doing ever since. Starting in the 1970s, we also opened our membership to men, so we have had both women and men be members of the League since then. And our major goal is to empower voters in whatever way that takes form. And of course, a lot of what we do is registering voters. A lot of what we do is making sure that we are protecting voters' access to being able to vote by trying to support things such as same-day voter registration, things of that sort, making sure that people's right to vote is protected. But we also do education on issues that people are concerned about, which is why we're here tonight. This is a nonpartisan, and we don't involve ourselves in endorsing candidates. We don't involve ourselves in endorsing parties. We are just here to be a source of information, which is nonpartisan, which is hard to find these days. So I'm happy to welcome you all here, and I'm glad the League is around to be able to be a source of information. And by the by, if any of you are interested in joining the League, we have membership forms in the back that you can join if you like. If you think also that defending democracy and providing information are important parts of our democracy. Just a quick note about voter registration. We have an election coming up next week. Is there anybody in here who needs to still register to vote? If you haven't, you still can, but you have to go to the election office directly, which is now temporarily out of the fairgrounds. And if you show up, they will give you your voter registration and get you ready to go for next week. We would be happy to register you here tonight, but we can't because we're past the deadline. So, yes, that's what we have for voter registration coming up. So last spring, the League did a meeting on housing prices called Myths and Realities of Housing, and I'm happy to report that MCAP taped that for us, and they're taping again tonight. So these meetings that we're having are archived on their website and can be viewed again by people who perhaps were not able to be here tonight. We're kind of creating a series of kind of housing affordability 101 sessions, and the last one was on the cost of construction and how that factors into housing. Tonight is on finance, and particularly in the areas of how do we finance housing in ways that bring the cost down so that people can afford to build it and can afford to be able to rent it or buy it. So that's what we're here for tonight in my backyard, Equitable Homes for All. You'll see on the chairs that as you came in, that there's both an agenda for this evening with the names of all the contact people who are going to be speaking so that you can get in touch with them afterwards if you'd like. And there's also a glossary of terms that we put together to help give a clue as to how to understand some of the lingo that gets tossed around when we talk about affordable housing. You know, there's a quote on that glossary that I just like to mention here. This is from a book called Evicted by Matthew Desmond. which, by the way, is an excellent book if you haven't read it. The home is the center of life. It is where meals are shared, quiet habits formed, dreams confessed, and traditions created. So for the well-being of all of us, it's important that all of us have homes. And that's why we're here tonight, is to talk about how we can use resources to help make homes more affordable to Missoulians. So just real quickly, about 49% of Missoula's renter households are paying more than 30% of their income for their housing costs. About 22% of our homeowners are paying more than 30% of their income for their housing costs. And when you add those together, over a third of Missoulians are cost burdened in trying to cover the cost of their housing. So that's just a little bit of background as to what's happening in Missoula. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Kaia Peterson. Kaia is with NeighborWorks Montana and is also with the Missoula Home Coalition. And I will invite Kaia to start right out by explaining a little bit about who the Missoula Home Coalition is, and then go on to give you some information about the basics of financing housing.
Thanks, Nancy. Good evening, everybody. As Nancy said, I'm Kaia. I'm with NeighborWorks Montana. I'm the current assistant director, but will be moving into the role of executive director as of January. And I love this work, so it's really a privilege to get to share some of this with you. The Missoula Home Coalition that Nancy mentioned is a co-sponsor of this event, and it's a group of affordable housing and housing interested organizations, along with everyday citizens who have been really active in working with the City of Missoula on the housing policy, and also working together to sort of understand and identify areas where we could be helpful in promoting homes that Missoulians can afford. So I know Jim Morton is in the room from the Human Resource Council. They're a member of the Home Coalition. Habitat Humanity is a member. Frankie is here. Any other Home Coalition members in the room? Andrea from Homeward. Thanks, Andrea. So glad to be co-sponsoring. And the coalition is kind of continuing to form. We work a lot with the Interfaith Collaborative, who's been doing a lot of community organizing and engagement. And we're just kind of trying to gear up for whatever the next phase of this work is together. So I want everyone to think about the word home. So when I say the word home, what is the first image that pops into your head? Just hold that there for a second. So how many of you had an image of something like this? Right? It's a home, it's a door and windows, it's not attached to any other structure. Probably there's one family living in this home. We're really working to help change that perception. It's a very natural perception. It's what we all draw as kindergartners when we're asked to draw a picture of home, right? These are all homes that I've lived in. And I want you to notice a few things about them. The picture in the middle, on the bottom, it looks like a single family home, but it's actually a sixplex. 3 of these homes included a live-work situation. So a business was operated out of it. 1 was a farm. 1 was connected to a wood shop and construction site. 1 was co-housing. So it was an elderly man who had a farm and had folks who helped supplement the work on the farm and paid the bills. Only one of these pictures is that image of home that so many of us think of when we say the word home. And it's interesting for me to try to remember that. I am a single-family homeowner here in Missoula. Been here for 10 years. That's not what my home looks like right now, but that is still the home I live in. And even for me, having lived in all these places, it's sometimes hard to remember that home means a lot of different things. And I think that's something for us as a community to really keep in mind, that in order to really meet the diverse needs of the people in our community, we need to provide and support diverse types of housing. So that's part of this conversation. It's not just about finance, although what I'm here to talk about mostly is how do we finance that diverse housing that our community really needs. So the other thing about these pictures is, to you, these are buildings. You might drive by these any given day on your way to work or to play or to visit family. But to me, these are the places where my life has unfolded. It's where I celebrated birthdays and holidays. It's where I learned to cook, recovered from illness, learned of my parents' divorce, brought home a new baby, relaxed after a long day, passed on traditions. So that's, I think, when we get into the nitty-gritties of the finance, which I find fascinating and exciting, I think remembering why this matters, right? This is how if we have a stable home, a safe home, in its ideal form, a home is a place where we can grow and thrive and can contribute to our community and be wonderful parts of our family and really meet our potential. So I hope that, our mission at NeighborWorks Montana, and I think the work of many of the housing organizations in the room, is really in pursuit of that vision, that everyone has a safe and stable home from which they can thrive. So let's talk deal making. I want to give you some context for why financing matters so that you have a bigger picture of how these projects get done. And basically there's 3 elements to any deal, and the other presenters may have a different way of framing this, but I think I spend a lot of time trying to explain this to all walks of life of people, and really there's the acquisition, purchasing the project, there's the operations, how does it function on a day-to-day basis, and then there's the financing, how much do you have to pay in debt to make that all happen. And really, if you think about your own life, one example you could think of is buying a car. Buying a car has pretty much all the same elements. So you have a purchase price. You need to do some due diligence to make sure the person you're buying it from is trustworthy and that the vehicle you're buying doesn't have any major issues with it. You're going to have to pay some fees when you buy that car, to the salesperson, to the lender. Then you're going to have to operate that car. You're going to have to pay for expenses like gas and insurance. You're going to have to pay for major improvements, like when you need to change out the alternator or change a belt. And then you're probably going to have to bring some cash to the table to buy that car. That's your equity. And you may need to take out a loan. That's your debt service. And ultimately, when you look at the whole package, your income has to be able to support all of those things, right? This is the exact same thing if you're buying a house, or you're buying a duplex, or you're working on a giant multi-million-dollar multifamily project. All those elements are there. The complexity and the elements that go into it get a little bit trickier, but I think we can all understand these pieces, and we can all understand what goes into creating or buying a property or buying a car. So I'm going to give you an example that I am very familiar with. I do a lot of work with residents of manufactured home parks, and I help them buy their land. Now, at first glance, this may not seem like the most typical affordable housing project, but I will tell you it is one of the simplest. And the reason I wanted to talk to you about it is not only because it's something that I know very well, but also because I do think it of all of the types of affordable housing that are built or preserved, this requires the least subsidy and is really the easiest business model to understand. So I think if you can understand this business model, you're going to be able to kind of understand these more complex business models as well. So let's talk about the elements of a deal like this. So we have 2 resident-owned communities in Missoula County. One is out on River Road, and the other is out by the airport. And when we went to look at those deals, first there's a purchase price, right? The property's for sale. And really, we're not going to be able to negotiate that down very much. This is a hot market. A lot of people may want to buy that property for redevelopment. The purchase price is what it is. So what I want to show you is where do we have room to influence this overall deal with the types of tools and levers that are in your little sheet. We're going to go in, we're going to get the property under contract, and then we're going to do due diligence. And that means we're going to hire an engineer, and we're going to get an appraisal, and we're going to talk with the residents and get them engaged. And that due diligence is going to cost us some money. And that's going to be very risky for us because we're going to be outlaying cash up front that we may not get back if we don't end up finishing that deal. So that's the first thing I want to point out. That's a really important place that a lot of programs are designed to support. Because if you can't even get through that initial development phase, there's no way you're going to be able to even evaluate whether one of these projects is going to happen. So in these deals, we have access to forgivable financing, forgivable debt, that if the deal doesn't go through, we're okay. We haven't lost that money. We're going to have to pay fees to our lender and to NeighborWorks Montana. So the residents buy it and they pay us some fees. We can negotiate those fees a little bit, but again, not a lot. So a lot of the acquisition costs are actually fairly fixed. We don't have a ton of opportunity to influence this. I think the other place that I've seen us getting some support is some grant money to pay for things like legal fees. So that's a pretty common economic development tool, right, to pay for those kinds of upfront costs. Then we're going to look at the operation. So how much is it going to cost us to, or the residents, to run this community long term? In a manufactured home park, it's a pretty simple business model, like I said, right? You don't have a big building that you have to maintain. You don't have a lot of systems other than sewer and water and roads. So really the expenses are fairly straightforward. You got to mow the lawns, you got to pay the sewer bill, you got to make sure that there's electricity going to all the homes. This is another area where we have some interesting ways to influence the long-term expenses. So one is that you might not think about, because this is a preservation project, we're taking an existing property and we're just trying to preserve it as affordable housing long-term. And because of the way that the underlying zoning and regulations are written, we don't have to go in and completely redo the infrastructure in these parks, unless something triggers that. So we don't have to put in curbs and gutters, we don't have to put in park space, we don't have to pave the roads. If we were going to redevelop this property, would likely have to do all of those things. So that's actually a cost savings, both in terms of the expenses and the capital improvements, that I think sometimes we don't think about, but actually has a huge impact on the viability of a project like this. So that's another tool, right? What are the requirements around your basic infrastructure? Another thing that we do with the expenses is we have some sweat equity. So residents are going to take on some of the work of managing this property. They may hire a property manager, they can choose to pay for full property management, or they can take on some of the work themselves. So that's their choice. If they want to mow the lawns, that's less expense that they have to pay out of their income and out of their pockets. And that's another kind of typical tool that you'll see used. I know Habitat for Humanity, USDA programs will often use sweat equity as a way for the person buying the property to be able to put some of their own work into it to reduce those costs. Okay? The third thing that's really important on these projects in terms of expenses and ongoing costs is property taxes. So with these projects and many affordable housing projects that you'll hear about, we are applying for property tax exemption. And we are able to do that because we're providing housing for low-income people, which is considered a public good. And so the state is willing to allow us to have those property taxes mitigated or waived. I know this is a very controversial issue, and I'm happy to talk more about it. I will tell you, for these deals, there are many of these that we couldn't get done without that relief, or we would have to find some other way to supplement that expense. And remember, that's an ongoing annual expense that they're going to have to cover every single year, and it's quite expensive. So those are the expenses. Those are some of the tools we use around expenses. And then the capital improvements. So many of these properties are going to have older infrastructure, sewer lines, water lines, septic systems, wells, things that need a lot of attention. In Montana, we actually have a lot of state funding for infrastructure, so we will often pursue state grants. And there are some local grants too. I know the water district will also often provide some support. So those are the key things around operations. And then there's financing. So depending on the cost of all those things and where they add up, we're going to look at that and we're going to say, okay, Here's the total expense. Now, how much income does the property need to generate every year to support those expenses? And remember, income is really the number we ultimately care the most about, because the income on this property is going to be generated by rents that the residents pay. So every time the expenses increase, the rent is going to have to go up. Every time the rent goes up, it's becoming less affordable for those very people who are trying to have an affordable place to live, right? So part of the way that we kind of balance out this equation and make sure that it's affordable long term is with the financing. So in a project like this, there's going to be zero equity. So when you buy a home, if you go to your lender and say, I want to buy a home, they're probably going to tell you, that's great, you need 20% cash to bring to the deal. Or maybe they'll tell you, you only need 3.5 because you're getting FHA, right? There's other programs out there, that's Downpayment Assistance. In these deals, these are residents with very low incomes and no cash. So they don't have any cash to bring to the purchase table. So the lender is going to lend them all the money they need. But if we lend them all the money they need at a standard interest rate, it's going to be very expensive for them. So that's where an organization like NeighborWorks Montana comes in. We are a community development financial institution, and our role is to help bridge the gap between what a project like this can pay and what a traditional financing mechanism might charge. So we are going to lend them all the money they need, so their loan to value, the amount of debt they're taking on compared to the value of the property is going to be very high, which can be risky, but we mitigate that risk with technical assistance. So we support the borrowers, we help make sure that they have a viable business model, and then we also may do things like extend the term. So if they would go to a local lender, they're probably only going to get a 25-year loan. We may give a 30-year loan, or a portion of their loan may even be longer than 30 years. We're also going to give them flexible terms if they need it. So let's say they have 2 lots that are vacant in their park and they need some time to fill those to generate the extra income. We may give them a period of no payments or interest-only payments until they can generate the income they need to support that debt long term. So that's sort of, from a financing standpoint, the role that a CDFI can play, and some of the ways that when we get to that bottom line and the expenses are just going to push that push the cost of those rents up too high for residents, we can play with the financing to try to keep those costs down. So that's a lot of pieces, a lot of tools that we use in one deal, and this is a horrible slide, but I put it this way on purpose to show you how much goes into just even the simplest form of an affordable housing project, right? We're not even doing major rehab, we're not dealing with federal tax credits, we're not layering 6 different types of financing. This is almost as simple as it gets. So these are all the things I just explained. And yes, it's a lot of words and it's overwhelming, but that's kind of the point. And remember, this is the end goal. We have these residents who now have a permanently affordable place to live long term. So one thing that's really important to remember when you're looking at these kinds of programs, typically those programs are going to be provided in exchange for some guarantee or some delivery on serving a certain level of income and over a certain period of time, right? So as a community development financial lender, we have to serve people. Most of our work has to go to people who are living below 80% of area median income. So we can't just raise those funds, operate as a nonprofit lender, and then go lend to high income people. So when residents enter into these loan agreements with us, they have to commit to continuing to operate this community in this way in perpetuity. So it has to be low income, and it has to be that way forever, essentially. So there are a lot of other tools that are on your sheet, and I would be happy to kind of talk through any number of those. But I just wanted to show you for Missoula, when I say 80% area median income and below, who we're talking about, right? So Our area median income right now in Missoula County is about $58,000. And most of our work and most of the work of the folks that you're going to hear from tonight goes to these lower income borrowers. The work Tyson does with tax credits, those are going to be targeted more at lower income folks, and there's going to be higher standards for how many low income people are served. And the orange is affordable rent or affordable mortgage payment for these folks. So we define affordable as 30% of your income going towards your housing, right? I think median rents are somewhere around $800 right now. That number is changing rapidly. Someone in the audience can correct me if I have that wrong, but you can see just sort of where people fit in our current market. Okay, so again, there's a lot of different tools, but I think I really wanted you all to understand every single tool that's in here. You could figure out where in this process it's trying to influence, right? So like, let's see, what's a good one? Tax increment financing. They're going to come in and help provide some of the capital improvement needs on a rehab or some of the infrastructure needs for rehabbing a property, right? So they're going to bring in some cash so that the amount of the debt is less. So that's one example, but every single one of these, I think you can see where it fits in a deal and what it's trying to influence. The other thing I just wanted to mention is that there is other work around affordable housing that's outside of these tools, right? So this mentions a little bit the zoning and the underlying regulations. That has a huge impact on where people can build, what projects are viable, and how housing is created and preserved in our community. Client services, there's a lot of work that goes directly to residents, so like helping people navigate the rental housing system through a landlord liaison or a housing navigator, case management, right, those kinds of services. And then, of course, wages and incomes. We can't talk about affordability. It's a two-sided coin, right? It's both price and income, and so that's a piece of it as well. Okay. So again, I think we have 10 minutes for Q&A, or are we done?
We're done.
Okay. Okay. I thought we had 20 minutes and then 10 minutes.
Yes. Oh, excuse me.
Okay. Okay.
If you overlapped a little into the question and answer period, so about you.
Okay, great. So if people have questions on specific tools or on anything that I described, I'd be happy to address those. Hi, Tyson.
Hi. Where does NeighborWorks get their money to lend out to borrowers?
So we have, that's a good question, we have a few different sources.
Please repeat the question.
Yep, so Tyson was asking, where does NeighborWorks Montana get the money that we use to lend out? So federal government grants and programs is one big piece. That's about a third of our loan pool. And then most of the rest is a couple different sources. Many banks will invest in our loan fund. That's part of their community reinvestment and sort of their community benefit and the work that they're doing in all of our communities. So they'll invest and then we'll lend those out according to our loan terms. And then private investment and private philanthropy are the other piece. Yeah. So just for scale, we have about a $30 million loan fund. Were you gonna ask that, Nancy? Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
And Kaia, what interest rate do you charge your clients in comparison to what we'll find out from the bank side, just so that we have a apples to apples?
So the rate isn't going to be that much different. So probably between 5 and 6% on a project like this. Again, we're taking the riskier part of the loan, so any other lender would be charging more. They would be risk rating that cost of financing, and then we're also using the terms and the repayment to give folks a little bit more flexibility. The other part of our loan fund that I didn't talk about, but is one of the programs on here, is Downpayment Assistance, right? So we do a lot of work to help people get into homeownership. Same concept, people don't have equity to bring to the table. It's hard to save when you're paying so much in rent. So we're lending people the down payment amount. And that can range from 0% and totally deferred, so they don't pay anything until they refinance or sell their home, to about 1 to 2% above the bank rate. So depending on the program. Yeah.
Kaia, could you talk about renting and the barriers to getting in?
So Nancy's asking about renting and the barriers to getting into rentals. So this is something that the Missoula Home Coalition has had a particular interest in, and as has, partly spurred by all the great work of the Interfaith Collaborative and the Voices for Housing, really bringing renters to the table and different folks who are struggling with accessing homes that are affordable. And there are a lot of different pieces, right? There's how do you get into a rental if you have bad credit or you have bad rental history? How do you get into a rental if you don't have rental history? Maybe you're coming out of the jail system or some other kind of life event. So those are, again, kind of that client services piece of the spectrum. But I think there's also some community systems that can be looked at. I know there's some conversation about working with landlords to streamline that application process so people don't have to pay so much so many times just to apply and be denied. Kind of building more transparency into that rental process so people know whether they may qualify upfront or not. Those kinds of things are the types of barriers that we see. And again, when you look at those rental numbers and what people can actually afford and how many units are actually available, folks are getting pushed into more crowded situations, more rundown properties, that kind of thing. Rental is not my expertise, so I definitely defer to others in the room if you have more you'd like to say on that.
Kaia, on the slide for the AMI.
Yeah. Oh, I did 2 people per home. I should have pointed that out.
But for a lot of us, that's the total amount. You have to reduce that by the utilities. So if you in your head think the utilities are costing you $150 a month, you need 80, you reduce that by $150, then that's going to be your rent. And then think how many homes are in this town that are $700 a month rent. So that's not the what we call the gross rent, that 880. That includes utilities for a lot of us.
Yeah, so this is a really great point that Jim is making. So his point is that the 30% should include the cost of utilities. And so if your utilities aren't included in your rent, you need to deduct that from, so like the 880, if you're paying $150 a month in utilities, really you only have $730 available to actually pay your rent every month. So that's, again, part of where we're seeing that gap between sort of ability to pay and what the actual costs are. Yeah.
How do your clients find you?
So for that particular program, we work with the current property owner first. Yeah. And then make our way to the residents from there. For our other programs, really, we are sort of an intermediary. We rely a lot on our lending partners and realtors and others to refer people who need the down payment assistance or other types of assistance to our programs.
Kaia, is part of what your organization does to help, alleviate the need for having to pay mortgage interest or
mortgage insurance? Yes, Heather, great. Yes. So mortgage, and I think maybe that's one of them on here too. Mortgage insurance, right, is a additional cost on a loan that sort of gives some additional insurance or assurance to the lending entity or to the guaranteeing entity. And we do have some programs that allow people to just get a conventional loan and not have to pay mortgage insurance. And so that is one way, again, in that financing kind of mix of what we look at, that we're trying to balance and make sure that people have access to some different options.
Are there lending products yet, or are there going to be lending products for people that want to do accessory dwelling units in their homes and start financing those types of projects?
So he's asking about financing for accessory dwelling units or adding units to a current property. Right now, and you folks from Clearwater Credit Union for Security may be able to speak to any existing products. I mean, I know people can use a home equity line of credit or other existing types of financing if their incomes and the equity they've built in their home allow them to do that. There are models in other places where they are trying to use like a CDFI or a city intermediary to provide some subsidized financing or the types of things we've talked about. We have an interest in that. I know we've talked to some local lenders. I know the city's looked at it. There's nothing specific. It's definitely something we have our eyes on. Yeah.
If you fast forward like 5 years or 10 years, how do you measure your success? Like, how do you think, oh, we're really crushing it here? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I think for us, we're really looking at how many folks have permanently affordable housing and how many of those units have we been able to bring online. But I think that in terms of as a community, how should we be looking at success? I think that's something that the city and the housing policy are really trying to help define, because it's so much bigger than what any one nonprofit can do, right? I mean, we're this teeny drop in the bucket in this broader picture of all of the housing in the market. And so I think, we're looking at measures like what's the housing cost burden and what's the percentage of people in our community who are housing cost burdened. And that's a much bigger issue that needs a lot of different things happening at the same time to really move that lever. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Kaia. She's going to be staying for the rest of the time, and in fact, she's going to be my tech person here running the computer. So if you have other questions, she'll still be here later to answer those. What I'd like to do now is turn to Veronica Stevens from the Clearwater Credit Union. Veronica is a lender who actually goes by the name of Ronnie, so yes. And why don't you come stand back here, because I just remembered that we're supposed to be trying to pick up on that mic too. So if you can just kind of hang around right in this area. You can even sit down if you want to. Okay. Ronnie's going to talk about all these wonderful things that we have out there to help with single-family homes and getting people into owning something.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to kind of like tag on to the first presentation. There are programs out there for financing on manufactured homes, and you can put as little as 5% down. And these are not detached. They're in, or they're not attached to like a permanent foundation. They're in a park. At least Clearwater has developed a program that allows for 5% down, no mortgage insurance. Basically, we do quite a few of them a month. We have to watch park saturation though, because we're one of the few lenders that does allow financing for non-permanent housing. And I know there are other ones out there, I just can't tell you who does it. I know Clearwater does. But the beauty of it is the 5% down can be a gift. There can be other ways we could look at helping you finance that. I think they want something in the game, and that's why they require at least 5% down of the credit union. But to move on, the traditional saying of we need 20% down, excellent credit, that is not the case nowadays. There are programs out there. Rural development allows 100% financing with reduced MI. It does have an upfront fee, but it can be financed into the loan. And the seller can buy back all your closing costs. So basically, you could walk in for little or nothing into a rural development loan. The unfortunate thing, though, it's not in the city limits. Hence the word rural development. It allows you to finance in the county and in other counties outlying Missoula County. But NeighborWorks is fabulous. We've worked with them on quite a few loans in my past, as far as they have an 80-20 program, which allows you to, we do the 20%, we do the 80, they do the 20%, I'm sorry, Mike. They do the 20%, and what it does is it gets rid of the MI, and the whole payment you're making to that loan is actually going to reducing your liability and increasing your equity quicker. Mortgage insurance doesn't give you that advantage. All it does is makes the banks and the credit unions a little bit fuzzy and warm inside, saying, okay, we got a little bit of protection in case the loan goes into default.
Ronnie, can you say what MI is again?
Oh, I am so sorry. Mortgage insurance is when a loan goes over 80% of either purchase price or appraised value, whichever is lower. And most companies require it because we sell on the secondary market. So unfortunately, almost any program out there, if you owe over 80% of the purchase price in your financing, you're going to have some type of mortgage insurance. FHA has it, Rural Development has it, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. Now, there are other loans out there, VA, but you have to be a veteran. It allows you to finance 100%. It does have an upfront funding fee, but it can be financed into the loan. There is also Human Resource Council. They sometimes will partner with different lenders to do an 80-20 type program. Theirs is not payable. It's basically a shared type equity loan, so it's silent until you refinance the loan or you sell the home. And then at that time you would have to pay that mortgage off. You don't have to make payments on it though until that point. And so there is another program. The big thing is for a lot of people though is you've got to get in. You got to get into a Homebuyer Program because Fannie Mae has a 3% loan. But you have to take a framework class, which can be done on the internet. Homeward offers a homebuyer class that's good for 3 years from the date of graduation to allow you to at least apply for some of these grants that are available. Some are payable, some are forgivable, but all require a first-time homebuyer course. The other thing I tell a lot of people is get in with a lender. Find somebody you feel comfortable with. Talk to your family, your friends. Get them to, talk to whoever helped you with your car loan. They can refer you to somebody, because the sooner you get in, the sooner you know what you qualify for. And also remember, banks qualify you, credit unions qualify you on your gross income. Well, we all know what we make and what we bring home are two different things. So a bank can qualify you for more than you really probably think you can afford. And rightly so. Because we don't take into effect health insurance that comes out of your paycheck. We don't take into effect any kind of loans you might have on your 401k or just different things like that. We don't also take into effect federal taxes, state taxes that come out of your check. VA is the only one that considers a residual income. So I try to tell people the sooner you get in with a lender or a counselor of some sort, they can start crunching numbers with you. They can look at credit with you and show you different ways to look at your credit and monitor it so that when you are ready to buy a home, you're not coming in with a buy-sell going, please, 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 I want this home, and being turned down. You're going in with that buy-sell because the lender told you you qualify. And it's much quicker and easier if you come in now, even if you're not ready, and have them explain to you what you need to do, how you need to do it. I mean, I know at the credit union we have free financial counselor right on site that will work with you as long as you need, and it's for members. And I know other institutions, their lenders, that's what they're there for. They're not there to lend necessarily, they're there to teach you and guide you through that process. And I don't care if you go to First Interstate, Stockman's, Clearwater Credit Union, we're all there to try to help because we know that this is a big monster and that there are a lot of programs, but the only way we can help you is if you come in and you start being proactive. Because it might seem like, well, I don't want to hear no. Well, it's not no. It's we just need to work towards that. We need to get you into a home, but this is how you need to do it.
Could you just comment about the availability of homes
Availability of homes or home loans?
in this
Oh.
price range?
Oh, that's the other thing. See, affordable housing is a big animal. I can give you loans all day long. I can improve them all day long, but finding a house you can afford is the next thing. And I used to have a realtor friend that would always tell me, I tell my clients to drive until they can buy, because Missoula is very expensive. Lolo is almost as expensive. Then when you get into Florence and Steve, it gets a little less expensive. And then there's pockets anywhere. You know, some areas are more touristy, so they're a little more expensive. Like when you get out to Sealy, you can find some beautiful homes that are very reasonable, and then you can find some very expensive homes. It's hard. We did the Lee Gordon project, and that was where they did some homes down in Front Street. They did those townhomes. I mean, for those people, they had to get qualified for a mortgage, and then they were in a lottery. There were so many people that wanted to buy those homes. And then to coordinate, we had to work with NeighborWorks, HomeStart, Montana Board of Housing. It was a lot of people involved to get those homes so that where they were affordable. Unfortunately, timing is everything. So getting qualified before you start looking is probably the best thing you can do for yourself. Homebuyer education is first. And then last, I want to say, all of you that have come tonight, you're making the first step. This is the hardest part, is coming in and getting informed. The next hardest part is realizing it's not your job to figure it all out. It's the lender. It's the underwriters. It's everybody that's involved. We're all in it together.
So we'll be taking questions for all of our last three speakers all at one time at the end. So I'd like to now turn over to Barbara Callaghan, who is now Barbara Rigg, who works with First Security Bank. She's going to talk a little bit about how public-private financing has worked in Missoula on a couple of projects.
I will set. And I need my tech person. She's not here. I just have two little slides, so. Can you come change this one? So and I actually made it bigger so that just part of it shows the picture.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
Yeah,
So there's the first part.
Great.
And then I'll scroll down. Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Great, thank you. So as I was sitting here listening to everyone, I was kind of thinking about how relevant what I have to say is really to the group. But in essence, I think it really is, especially listening to Nancy and what the role and goal is of the League of Women Voters. What I'm talking a little bit about tonight are some public and private partnerships that we've been involved in. I'm a commercial lender at First Security Bank, and we get involved with a lot of projects that involve the city and the county. We do a lot of multifamily financing, of course, single-family home financing, which I'm not here to talk about, but development financing for the developers in town. We work with a lot of the really incredible nonprofits that we have in this town that support affordability. We do low-income housing tax credit financing that Tyson's going to hit on. But what I'm going to talk a little bit about is a couple examples of some of the partnerships that, public-private partnerships that we've been involved in that have really helped to increase the affordability for some of the projects in town. So a couple things that I'm going to talk about. One is, I think I saw Andrea in here with Homeward. We had the opportunity to partner a couple years ago now. There was one of these low-income housing tax credit projects that was, I think, the first one in Missoula. I think it's a 200 unit, 300? 160 units. It was one of the first low-income housing tax credit projects that was done in town, and it was through its tax credit period, so it was going back on the market. The developer was selling it, and there were, I think, 8 or 9 buyers bidding on this project, and they were all going to put this project back on the market at market rate rents. So all these rents were going to be going up. So Homeward was working hard to try and figure out how to structure this so that the financing was made sense, so that they in turn could keep this as an affordable lower rent project. So we worked with Homeward and put together a couple different programs that we have access to, and I really credit our city and our county for being proactive and willing to work with us in these projects. The first thing I'm just going to talk to a little bit is tax-exempt financing. What we did on the Creekside project with Homeward was we called up the city and said, hey, would you be willing to allow us to use your tax-exempt status to finance this project? So there is state, I'm kind of going to read what I wrote there, but state and local governments have the ability to, the way they're structured is they don't have to pay federal income tax on their borrowing, on their interest that they pay. So they can pass that benefit on as a conduit to another lender. So in this case, First Security Bank bought this bond. It was a qualified 501c3 bond because Homeward is a qualified 501c3 entity. So First Security Bank was able to purchase that bond. We then, in turn, when Homeward pays interest to us on that bond, we don't have to pay federal income tax on that. So we, in turn, reduce the rate that we charge Homeward, and they can then pass that on to their project, and the financing will be a little bit less expensive. So the city worked with us on that. We were able to do that through the city. And then in addition to that, a lot of the banks, and kind of talked on this a little bit as far as a source of funding, we also worked with NeighborWorks, and we injected what's called an equity equivalent investment. And this is something that a lot of the banks, the bigger banks typically, will use because it's excellent CRA. Banks get excellent CRA credit for this, but they can invest in these projects at a very, very low interest rate and with very, very flexible terms. So the combination of these two programs allowed Homeward to go in and buy that project and actually compete with the market rent buyers on that project. So those are a couple examples of private-public partnerships that work to help make these projects a little bit more affordable. The other thing I was going to just touch on a little bit is tax increment financing, and a lot of you in the room may be very familiar with it, some maybe not so much, but this in many cities across the country, the cities will create what are called urban renewal districts. And those are very defined areas in a city where, and those urban renewal districts have a life, anywhere from 15 typically to 25 years. And during that term, any of the incremental property tax that is created from the economic development that happens in that district goes into a fund that can be used to do a handful of things. And in Missoula, it's the Missoula Redevelopment Agency that manages those funds. And we've been involved in quite a few different projects in town where tax increment financing has been used to help make housing much more affordable. A couple examples of that, I know just at the last MRA meeting, their board voted to invest over $1 million in sidewalks, curbs, gutters in a couple of their districts. And how that helps affordability is then the homeowner doesn't have to then pay for those improvements. It makes the neighborhood typically much more safer. It improves the livability of the neighborhood. So in a very real way, that makes that tax increment financing makes those neighborhoods more affordable. Tax increment financing is used to do a lot of general infrastructure in these neighborhoods. They're typically, or I think always, considered blighted neighborhoods when the district is first established. So The tax increment funds are used to help with site improvements, with demolition, with infrastructure. We were involved in, as I said, a handful of projects. One was down in the old sawmill district, which was a very blighted, environmentally, there were a lot of environmental issues on that site, and the tax increment financing allowed the Wyoming to go through, which is now going to be a major connector with what's happening on Russell. It rebuilt the trestle bridge there at the sawmill district, and made that neighborhood actually a much more viable economic area. So another example where we use tax increment financing with a local developer, and a for-profit developer can go into MRA and apply for those funds. We had, great, thank you, a project where MRA approved $600,000 and to go into the Scott Street development that Dave Vigil did north on Scott Street. There were 52 homes that were built there, and that allowed him in turn to make those homes much more affordable than they might have otherwise been. Those homes sold for $162,000 to $257,000, I think was the highest priced home. And as I said, I think tax increment financing played a role in keeping those houses much more affordable. So anyway, just a couple examples of some public-private partnerships that we've been involved in.
Thank you.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you.
So now I'd like to invite Tyson O'Connell to come up and speak for a few minutes about some tools that he's been using. He also has done some projects in other states that he'd like to share with us. And part of the reason for sharing those is to illustrate some of the tools that are available elsewhere that we may not actually have yet in Montana. So Tyson, come on up and let's hear from you.
Which, you want Rio first?
Yeah, let's do Rio first.
Rio first.
I bet you can't read that, but I'll try to go through.
Let me take that out of there if you want. Just stay close to here.
Okay.
Okay.
Do you want me just to sit down?
You could if you would. Yep,
Okay.
that's good. All right.
Okay, so I'm Tyson O'Connell. I'm with Rocky Mountain Development Group, it says on here. I'm with Wish Camper Partners and Wish Rock. We have a bunch of different operating entity names. We're an affordable housing developer here in Missoula, and as was alluded to, we do some work in Montana, and we do some work outside of Montana. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Can you all hear me? So I'm supposed to cover some of the things that the previous speakers alluded to. Low-income housing tax credits is one, and then also what do we need in Montana? Those are some things. And I think, as I was thinking about this, one of the things that's probably not a surprise to all of you, but I'll just summarize it quickly. Montana is a unique state because we have a really low population overall, but we have people that are willing to pay a premium to live here, and it seems like that is constantly being it's getting more and more prevalent. Some people are second homes, some people are relocating here, but that's the reality that we live in, and that's the thing that I don't think we can change. So I think that's something we all have to accept unless we want to make Missoula a worse place to live voluntarily, and I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, the secret's out. People love living in Montana, in Missoula, and Bozeman, and all of these places. So what that does is it drives up property values, and it creates a large gap between affordable homes. I think some of the statistics that were shown at the very beginning about what people can actually afford in Missoula versus how much they're earning, you start to really put the pen to the paper and you look and you think it's somebody said the median rent was $800. Whoever said that, that seems low to me. I mean it seems even higher than that to me. I think that may and it's hard for people to afford rent at $800, and as we all know, there's rents on some of the higher end places, whether you want to rent a home or an apartment, a single family home or an apartment home, and it gets really expensive. So what our company does is a little different than what was previously mentioned, but it's also the same. We try to provide affordable housing, and we do it in a way that is supposed to be larger scale, similar to some of the projects that were mentioned that Homeward does. One of the things that we notice, I was in Helena, actually we just went through an award cycle of these low-income housing tax credits that I'm going to talk about, and I was there on Monday. And Bozeman came up and they did they mentioned one of the studies they have. They need to have 5,800 affordable homes built in the next 5 years to keep up with the current demand. I mean, that is staggering. It's unbelievable. I don't know exactly what it is for Missoula. We probably have those statistics. It's just unbelievable. So it's really hard to keep up with that demand if you don't have a lot of smart people working really hard and a lot of community-oriented people putting their heads together and trying to come up with creative ways. So I'm going to just give a couple examples here, and I don't think you're going to be able to read this, but I'll allude to a lot of the terms that you see in that glossary sheet. And I think the very beginning, when we talked about, and I thought this was brilliant actually, when you go to buy a car, there's an acquisitions, there's the operations, and then there's the financing. And in these large-scale multifamily developments, the financing part can become pretty complicated. In a very simple apartment complex, let's think of a very high-end complex. A developer comes into town and they want to build, we'll call it 100 apartment homes, and they can rent them for whatever price they want to. And it costs $10 million to build that. They're going to go to a bank and they're going to get an $8 million loan, and then they're going to put $2 million of their own cash into it, or they're going to raise it through some sort of fund. That's a pretty simple, it's a large transaction in terms of numbers, but it's a pretty simple transaction really overall, because that developer can raise the rents as much as they want, as much as the market will allow, to be able to support the debt service on their project and to be able to make a return on their to the $2 million they put in. That's different if you're voluntarily agreeing to limit your rents, which is what we do, what Homeward does, what Jim does. We say, okay, we're going to build a brand new housing complex, and it's going to have, we have one out here. I should have put a picture of that, but it's right next to Creekside. It's called Silvertip. We did it about 5 or 6 years ago. It's a brand new, beautiful apartment complex right on the river. We could rent those units for a lot more than people are renting them for if it was market. But we voluntarily agreed to put a deed restriction on the property that said, we will rent those units for the life of this property to very low-income people, 30% AMI, 40% AMI, 50, all the way up to 80% AMI. And we'll only charge $340 a month or $440 a month to the 30% AMI people, even though those apartment homes would rent for $1,200 a month if they weren't doing that. We do that because we have a mission to provide affordable housing, and we do it because the way that we put that project together is we don't have to put in our own capital and our own equity like a market rate developer would do. We actually apply for low-income housing tax credits, and that's where the equity comes into the project. What do those mean? I'm going to try to say it as simply as I can. We go and we apply for these tax credits, and if we're awarded the tax credits, we are able to raise, on a $10 million project, I'm just going to use rough numbers here, but we may be able to raise $6 million in tax credit equity for that project. And the way that equity comes in is sometimes you hear about General Electric didn't pay any taxes, or Morgan Stanley didn't pay any taxes in these big companies. Well, they may have bought tax credits for something that is actually a great community benefit. And low-income housing tax credits, I'm extremely biased, but it's a very good program. And it's something where these companies can come in and they can say, all right, I want to know what my tax liability is going to be for the next 10 years. I'm going to buy credits and I'm going to help build a project in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is what this Rio Vista project is that I'm going to show you. So that's how the money comes in. It's highly competitive, and there aren't enough of them, particularly in Montana. I won't get too far into it, but 9% credits are the most valuable credits. They're awarded based on the populations in the state. We have a tiny population, so we get the minimum award each year. I think it's $3 million, where a state like California may get $200 million to put out there. So it's a pretty small amount. It's highly competitive, and everybody wants them. Every Missoula, Dillon, the developers are trying to put together these awesome projects in all different places. Jim's been working on a project for 5 years that is a phenomenal project that just finally got funded. So congratulations, Jim. But he really worked really hard to do it. And it's a project, when you read it on paper, I just want to bash my head off the table, because it should have got funded 5 years ago. It's such a valid project, but there's all these other ones that are so good. So the resources are limited. And that's what I'm going to talk about here. Is I'm going to show you one of the things that we do. So there's two kinds of affordable housing development in multifamily housing. There's building new construction, which is really, really needed. I just said Bozeman needs 5,800 units of affordable housing in the next 5 years. But then there's also preserving current affordable housing projects. And that's really important, because if you don't preserve those in Bozeman, you're going to lose more. You may have a 100-unit project that is affordable now and may have a deed restriction on it, but it may be expiring, and someone's going to come in and make it into a high-end condo market. So we do a lot of preserving properties. This Rio project is, let's go down. Okay, so let's just look at the thing up there, and I'll read it to you. These are the partners who were involved in this project. We had the New Mexico Financing Agency, we had the county, we had Albuquerque Housing Authority, we had Boston Financial, Prudential, Wishrock, which is us, and then we had our contractors down below. But all of those people gave us some sort of financing, or came together and brought some resources together. And it just really shows how much needs to happen on this. It's not as simple as going into a bank, having one bank or a credit union and saying, all right, I want to take a loan. We're definitely doing that, but that loan isn't enough. And then we need to go and find other resources to put it together. So that's one of the tools that we do. Can we go down to the next? So you may not be able to see it, but this is really typical of affordable housing projects that were built in. This one was built in the 70s. If you look up in there, it was a fine project when it was built, but it's 50 years old. Not much has gone into it. It needs way more than any person would come in and say, I'll put my own money into this and then I'll take out a loan, because they're not going to get any return on their investment. So there has to be some sort of incentive, and that's what the tax credit program is. You can see we completely changed the look of it and everything. And let's go to the next. Let's go to the next one, because the next one is even more complex with all of the different tools that we put together.
You want to go to the skyline?
Yeah, if we can. And I think it has a slideshow in it too.
Yeah.
Or a video
Wait
in
a
it.
minute, I might tech person.
Okay. She's back.
Do it all. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so when we had the diagram right at the beginning that said there's the acquisition, there's the operations, there's the financing. In a simple project, you have your own equity, which is your cash you put in, and then you have debt service alone. So that's two sources. This project right here had 12. It had 12 different sources, ranging from pretty small amounts up to $6 million in tax credit equity. So it was, and trust me, I don't want to put 12 sources into it. Neither does any developer. It's a lot of headache. It's really difficult for everybody involved, but everybody comes together. Just as we said earlier, it's not one person that does this. It's a bunch of different people coming together and forming a partnership to make sure they can preserve this project long term. So can we go down just a little bit on this one? This is the same thing. This building, I don't understand how it was built. It's in Norfolk, Nebraska, which is the hometown of Johnny Carson, and nothing else. It has nothing else going. It's kind of just a small little 20,000 person town, and it's this really nice building that was built for, and it's restricted to seniors and residents with special needs. people that don't have a lot of income or maybe have no income or on fixed incomes. And it was built in 1971, and it served the community really well for a long time. Well, now it was falling apart. We purchased this property before we rehabbed it, and this was a labor of love for our company and a pro bono project, essentially, even in the end. But we had to get it done. We already owned it. We didn't have a choice, and nobody else was going to do it. So finally, we put all of these different resources together, and we found a way to make it into a really nice project. Can we go down just a little bit? So you can see now, it's hard. I don't have a lot of good befores, but it's really nice and modern now. I'm not going to show the video because I just have 2 minutes. So I want to cover what other states have that Montana could have that would help. And the reality is Montana actually has really good tools. I mean, we do. We have a lot of the tools that other states have. The one we don't have is a state low-income housing tax credit. And we have a federal one, which is very valuable and which really helps projects get done. But it's probably going to do 200 units this year, the 9% credit in Montana. Bozeman needs 5,800. Missoula needs more. I mean, it's just not keeping up with it. So last session, I'm a member of the Montana Housing Coalition as well, and we went in and came really close to getting a low-income housing state tax credit passed, which tax credits are kind of a bad word in our legislature, but we came close. So that's something that the League of Voters should be very interested in, because we're going to be coming back and definitely lobbying for that again.
In Montana, that's the only way you're ever going to get it done. Count on coming 6 times.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Which bill was it?
I don't remember the number. Andrea probably does.
Senate Bill 18.
Senate Bill 18. And I have one more thing. Yeah. So that's one big thing. There's another thing that Montana can do, and Missoula's at the front of this, and I'm going to give some accolades and recognition to Aaron Pehan, who's in the back, who is very modest and doesn't ever seek out anything like this. But Missoula's doing a really good job. These are really long pipeline projects to make a difference. But she's the Housing and Community Development Director for Missoula, and Montana is going to do about 200 9% units this year, and I think Missoula alone has almost 500 affordable housing units in the pipeline. That's a big deal. Like, there's no other place in Montana that's doing that. Bozeman is now trying to copy what we're doing, and they need to, but we are very lucky to have her, and we're very lucky to have a lot of people who are coming together to do this. So it's not a fight that we're winning, but we are making progress in it right now. Any other questions, or are your eyes all glazed over?
I would invite all 3 of you to come back up again and open it up for questions in general for any of these folks. Go ahead. Or comments? Why don't we just go ahead?
Let's get more chairs. So we're.
Oh, I don't need a chair. I sit
Are
all
you
day.
sure?
Yes.
You can have the rocking chair.
No, they are.
Or we can pass this back.
I'm good. Okay.
I'd rather stand too.
Okay, all right, fine. Just be sure you keep the
Jim.
hand around right here. Yeah.
I just want to, sorry my voice, but the lease really has a great wealth of information from people who have been in the business. And Andrea Davis back here and Tyson O'Connell were fantastic in front of the legislature talking about this tax credit. The House passed it. It got into the Senate, and the first time in the decades I've been watching the legislature, the Senate committee asked for a special presentation at night about these tax credits. So I'd really encourage the league to get Tyson and Andrea, Aaron and the others, because we got to do it again, and we have the expertise here. If you get a chance, call up those hearings, because Andrea and Tyson and others made this very difficult process manageable and straightforward and understandable. So kudos to them.
And what committee was that before?
Taxation.
Senate Taxation.
Senate Taxation Committee. Okay, for those of you who are not legislature wonks,
I happen to be a legislature wonk. If you go to the website for the Montana legislature, there is a place you can find that will talk about the last session. You can go in there and there's an archive where they have videos of all of the hearings. If they don't have video, they have audio of all of the hearings on all of the bills from last session. So you would go to the archive for the Senate Finance Committee and look through and find.
Yes. Yeah, you're correct.
All right.
I said Senate tax, yeah. Senate finance.
Senate Finance?
In tax. It looks like they moved it.
Started in Senate tax?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it was never in the House.
No,
It was in the House Taxation Committee and then the Senate Finance.
Senate Finance, okay? So those would be the places you would look to find the archive of this hearing. But I think the more important question is how can we prepare to be in there next time around, which is part of the reason why the League was supporting this meeting this evening, was to be able to engage all of you in this discussion so that when it comes around next time, we have more people aware of why it is that Montana needs to have its own state tax credit program. So, yeah.
I live up in the South Hills, and so when I go up Hillview, there's a property to the left that had a big sign, and rumor had that it was however many acres, it was $6 million. And I've noticed that somebody's planted some trees, and the sign came down. Did that property sell? Because now we're all wondering if that's all going to be developed. We kind of like it open, although the deer could go.
I don't know.
Don't know. But that's a perfect segue into a little bit of a plug for our meeting coming up, and I'll come back to you in just a second. So part of the question that we have to deal with as a community is, where are we going to add these houses? Mm-hmm. I did actually do that calculation for Missoula last spring of how many units we need, and I came up with about 5,000. So we're adding them on average at a rate of about 25 or 30 a year, which is better than a lot of other places, but still falling behind. We do have a big chunk coming online in the next year or two, so that's wonderful. But we need to be thinking about where these houses are going to go. So 1 week from tonight, on November 6th, right here in this very room, we are sponsoring another meeting which will give all of you who come the opportunity to actually look at a hypothetical neighborhood and think about where in that neighborhood you would put those units. Because if we want to make these units affordable, they pretty much need to go where we already have paid for the infrastructure. We can't afford to build them if we're going to be building a whole bunch of new infrastructure on top of the cost of getting them built in the first place. So our first most affordable places to put them are places where there already is infrastructure, which means infilling in neighborhoods that are already here. So I invite you all to come back a week from tonight and engage in that exercise. It is hypothetical, so you you're not giving away anything in your own neighborhood, but it will give you an opportunity to really grapple with what these things are and what we need to be considering for the future. Okay, Jennifer.
I'm just curious as whether any of you have experience with or know about investigations into cooperative housing models for the elderly and for the handicapped, where people have some private living space but then share many facilities.
I can talk about this one. There has been a lot of investigation and interest over the years. Bill Carey was a county commissioner who had a strong interest in co-ops and actually moved away from Missoula to live in a co-op, to buy a co-op unit in Fort Collins, I think. There is a cooperative development going in down in Stevensville? Hamilton, thank you. I knew I had that wrong. That the aging services down there is developing, and it is some of what you're talking about. They're trying to build homes that people can age in place and then eventually have opportunities for assisted living long term. Right now it's a market rate development, but it'll be limited equity. So over time, those units will be more and more affordable as presumably the market continues to increase, but those units kind of stay at the same price. That's the only local example we have. I think one of the challenges with cooperative development, and we didn't really talk about this, but I know Tyson sees this, is the scale of development. For some of these programs, you really have to build a lot of units in order to make that whole financing stack work. And that doesn't always work for our markets here in Montana. We see that as a CDFI all the time, where it's just more expensive to build a fewer units. So I think that's something we have to grapple with, but the economics of that may be shifting.
And then the other side of the question was for the handicapped and accessible. For people with MS, for example, Montana has very high rates of MS.
Yeah, I don't know of examples of that, but I know that the disability rights advocates have been really, well, Ronan's here, hi, working a lot on just accessibility and how we do that and how we do it affordably. I would say one of the things I'm most excited about is some of the work happening around Medicaid and trying to look at Medicaid waivers that can support housing improvements, and the disability rights community has been really phenomenal in leading that charge.
Yeah, I'm part of the faith community in town. Some of my fellow church members are there. And I know that a lot of churches, including Holy Spirit Episcopal, where I go to church, have prioritized housing as an issue that we're concerned about. And I know other parts of the country, the faith community has gotten involved using the assets that are contained within the churches and the members of the churches to start helping fund the development of affordable housing in communities. I know one in the Boston area where I was more affiliated with. I'm just wondering if, I don't know the technical details of those, but just wondering if there's models that could be used for the faith community to get more involved directly in creating affordable housing in Missoula.
So, I mean, the Missoula Interfaith Collaborative is really leading the charge on bringing the faith community together, and then also bringing a broader community together around this shared issue. I think, you know, the types of, are you involved with their efforts?
Yeah, I'm very familiar.
Yeah.
Very closely with Nick.
Yeah.
I'm actually thinking more along kind of direct financing. So, you know, like, you know,
okay.
Churches, many of the older churches have endowments that could get invested in affordable housing.
I love this question.
There are members of the church that have assets that could get invested in funds for this. It just, I think, needs some work to get organized. And I think as the Missoula Interfaith Collaborative has done a very great job of helping churches understand the needs of the community and then get invested in those things. So, you know, our church's Holy Spirit has prioritized housing as an issue that we're really focusing on right now. And the question as a member of their social justice committee and a person who thinks about this stuff is like, well, yeah, we could be doing policy work, which we absolutely need to be doing, and, you know, getting a tax credit, I think makes a lot of sense. But we could also be creating housing. There's a Episcopal city mission in the Boston area creates affordable housing as part of its funding model. They actually make money on it, and then they can rent out for other things. And so I'm just wondering if there's models like that we could be engaging the faith community on.
Very cool. Yes. So certainly, I mean, there are a lot of churches who own those kinds of assets and manage those assets and rent them at affordable rates or break even. So that's a model that exists out there. And I think having, you know, private landlords who are willing to maintain affordable rents is one part of the puzzle, certainly. The part I got really excited about is the investment piece. So, and Andrea and Jim, I saw both your eyebrows raised. They're both on the NeighborWorks Montana board and interested in this topic as well. Traditionally, so community development financial institutions, the very first investors were religious organizations, faith-based organizations, and Ms. Magazine. Who knew, right? So women and faith, right? And we actually, like when you look at CDFIs across the country and you look at their portfolios, so when Tyson asked me the question, where does your money come from? Many CDFIs, 25-30% of their loan fund comes from faith-based groups. And so what those faith-based groups are doing is taking some of that corpus of their endowment, and instead of investing it in the stock market, they're investing it locally in a CDFI. We have individual investors in our CDFI, so that's another avenue, not to be, you know, too focused on that particular mechanism, but there's also, I mean, there are models in our community where specific projects, Homework has done this, where they've had investors directly in their projects. So, you know, taking on the long-term project of owning and managing assets and real estate. That's not going to be for every church and every organization, but there are other entities in this room who are doing some of that work and need 12 partners to get a deal done. So I think that that's an interesting
So
and
the
great
church
concept.
had, I'm just throwing around like $50,000 that it wanted to, now that it wanted to invest in NeighborWorks. That's the thing that could happen.
Yeah.
That's okay. So I sit on city council, and periodically we have people that come in and I think really have a misperception about the risk that is involved when it comes to development. I think all of us know that when we take on risk, when we get a loan, whether it's for an automobile or for it's a home, but I don't think we necessarily know how to necessarily transpose that to being a developer. I think there's such a myth around that developers are making huge bank and that they're making all this money and that we, the people, are victims of that. And I guess I come back to this idea that every one of us, no matter what shape our home is, we are a beneficiary of a developer of the past. I think what people really fear is those bad projects that were built back in the 60s and 70s that have lived out their lifespan, and they don't want to see that happening in their own backyard. So I'm wondering, perhaps, if someone would be willing to talk about what the risk is like as a developer.
I don't think I'll talk about the not in my backyard. That kind of sounds like that's what the panel is next week.
Next week.
Yeah, I mean that's huge. You deal with it all the time, and there's a lot of stigmas that go with it. And NIMBYism is alive and well in many communities, including Missoula. But the risk to a developer are they're great. The banks often tell us how great they are, and they want to limit the amount of money that we can borrow from them. And so there are a lot of checks and balances that go into a project to get a project funded that it's hard to describe that to someone who's coming in and pushing against development. We're always going to have something like that, but they are really they're great. I think right now, affordable housing, in my opinion, because that's exactly where we focus. It's the only place we focus. I consider it less risky because I've put my livelihood on it, and also because in places where we operate, there's such a need for it, right? I mean, if you need 5,800 affordable homes and you build whatever you build, a condominium, a mobile home park, an apartment complex, a townhome, you're gonna be able to keep that full for a long time, and you're gonna provide someone with affordable housing. So I feel I'm biased, and I feel it's a little less risky, but it's always risky. I mean, you're putting your capital at risk or somebody else's capital at risk, and then you're going through an entitlement process, and it becomes a political process, as you see when you're on the city council. And I do think one of the, and I saw it in the glossary, one of the things that can really help with every kind of development, not just the development that we do, but that every developer does, is speeding up the process and being able to, so you don't have to wait 12 months to get into the ground on something. I know it's easier said than done, and there's a lot of resources that go into it, but a lot of the risk right now is related to interest rate risk. Interest rates are so low, it's an incredible opportunity for home buyers, developers, for all kinds of things. But if you underwrite something really aggressively, and they are bouncing all over the place, and we continue to think they're going to go up, and eventually they are. If you're assuming you're going to get a 4% rate and you get a 5% rate, that's going to drastically reduce the amount of homes you can build, or it's going to blow up the whole project. So.
One thing to that.
You want to come here and use the mic?
Yeah.
So I think part of the issue is that developers can make a lot of money in this town, and the reason that developers make a lot of money is because there's high barriers to entry. Not very many people can put the deals together to become developers, so there's not a lot of competition. And it's all relative, there is competition out there, but if people are worried that developers are making too much money, then I think what we need to do is figure out how to get more people developing. So if there's more competition, so that drives down the cost that they're willing to pay, or drives up the cost that they're willing to pay for the land, and drives down the profit margins they're willing to take. I mean, part of the thing that, all of these federal programs are so critical to serving the very lowest of income, but there is such a huge gap between what we're going to get served by federal and state programs and what the need is, and that we also need to look at how do we remove the barriers to allowing the market to drop down to its lowest possible level so that the market can naturally serve as many people as possible. So
the time is 8:30 and the library will be closing in 30 minutes.
The airstrikes are coming.
Web Alley and other public internet terminals will close in 15 minutes. If you're using one of our public meeting rooms, you have 15 minutes to clean up and vacate your room.
Guess that's my cue.
And I'll just touch on that a little bit too. I've been a commercial lender in Missoula for 25 years and have done a tremendous amount of development financing. And I can tell you that they take on a tremendous amount of risk. And I'm continually surprised at their willingness to do that, for one, and that the profits aren't really that significant.
Can you talk about the profit range?
I would say that on a standard, non-affordable housing type project, I think typically they're trying to target 12 to 15%. And when you're, that's a pretty good return on your money, but they're taking on a tremendous amount of risk to do it. And if they reach that, that's the best case scenario.
And that's usually over a 2 or 3 year period too.
Or a 10-year period. Some of these developments are phased, and they've invested in the land, so they have long holding costs too. So I can attest to the fact that they are not making a ton of money. Low-income housing tax credit developers, we've been involved in on both the equity side, purchasing the tax credits, and also on the lending side. And I know of a couple of examples where their full development fee went back into the project. And they incur a tremendous amount of cost up front before they even know if they're going to get allocated the tax credits. So, kudos to the developers that are willing to take on those risks, really.
Okay, thank you.
The library will be closing. So thank you all for coming tonight. And again, just a reminder, next week on the 6th of November, right here, 7 o'clock, we'll be grappling with those very questions about NIMBYism and where we're going to put these houses. Yes, Jennifer? Take us with me on the way out. Jennifer doesn't want to take it home. Thank you all very much for coming, and we'll see you next week.